Once again, everyone, good morning and welcome to the Residency Liaison meeting for April. We're glad that everybody has been able to join us this morning. And without further ado, we will go ahead and get things going and moving here. We have a few questions that we've received via the online form and an email. This slide deck has changed from the slide deck that I sent out to everyone earlier because we did receive one question a little later. I will send a new slide deck out to everyone along with the recording link in a few days. So once we get it all processed and everything, so you will get an updated slide deck because this one has changed slightly. The first question. Uh, Again, if you're, I'd ask that you
Oh, I
mute your,
guess it is coming through there.
thank you. There we go. Got you muted. We'll get started here with the very first question, and that is, can military IDs be copied? So we had several conversations with General Counsel Tawanda Foster Artis here at the system office, and basically her answer is yay, yes, it may be copied. If the reason is because you need that information to administer benefits to the student, basically. And you can see her quote there on this slide. However, I think that Gene is on the line. I saw him earlier, and he may want to respond to this as well, Gene. So I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. So it's permissible to copy those military IDs. The next question is it really needed? And so I think Gene later on is going to talk a little bit about what kind of documentation and things that you need to keep at the local college. And so military IDs may or may not necessarily need to be copied. However, if your local policy is that you need to have a copy of that military ID for eligibility requirements for benefits, then yes, it is permissible. So I'll pause there to see if we have any questions in the chat or if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. And so we'll go ahead and move on. And then this question, it goes around the students who are B visa holders, which are the visitor visas, the tourist type of visas. If you travel on vacation to another country, you would get a similar visa going to that other country. And so the question that we've had posed several months ago is, are those people with holding that visa, are they eligible to go to curriculum college to attend courses? And so Ms. Artis, she also researched this question, and her answer was basically that even though there is not a law prohibiting the B visa holders to attend college credit courses, if you do some searching online with several of the different federal agencies, you will find that, like with ICE and a couple other areas, that the B visas are to be limited to what's being called recreational courses. And I would interpret that to be our non-college credit courses. Therefore, our guidance to you is that somebody who is holding a B visa not be admitted to college credit courses. There's lots of different links that you could find out there, but I did provide one link there which provides a nice little chart. I do warn you, though, that when you see the B visa on the chart, it has an asterisk or a footnote, I can't remember which, and you need to go down to the footnote area, and that's where it describes that it needs to be recreational type of courses that the student can take on there. And so hopefully that will give you the guidance you need there and also will answer that question. So I'll pause again to see if there's any follow-up questions, and feel free to put that in the chat or unmute your microphone. Okay, I'm not hearing any. I was trying to pause long enough to make sure we didn't have too much of a delay. This question is taking up two slides. I believe this came from, I can't remember for sure, so I don't want to call anybody out. So this has been an ongoing question for quite some time. And it has to do with basically what happens um, when somebody's residency status changes in the middle of the term, specifically from out to in, because that's when it usually can generate a refund of some sort. And at times it can go back in time, which then causes some interesting processes and procedures. And so you can see here, there's a couple of different questions. I'm not going to read through all of these, but you've had the slides and you've got a chance here to read those. But we have a couple of different questions on this slide, and then I'll go ahead and move to the second slide for the third question. And so to answer the first question is basically, uh, yes, if the residency changes to the current semester tuition, that should be applied to that semester. And if you run bill for that student during that semester and it generates a refund, regardless of when the timing is, the colleague is set up towards with the correct to operate the correct policy, and so therefore the student should receive that refund. Uh, the same is if that is in a previous semester. So if the business office runs bill on JW for fall 21 and it generates a refund, then then JW is eligible for that refund. Um, so then we have a question about what is the fall, spring, and summer. And so, or what are the terms? So we've set colleague up, well, we didn't set colleague up. The colleague works, by my understanding, on the three major semesters, and that's fall, spring, and summer. So the dates are set up to generate refunds based upon those semesters. If it happens between semesters, I know that there are rules that will generate the refund appropriately. However, I don't know those nitty-gritty details. That's more into the operation and colleague piece. I have to admit, when we start answering these questions, I'm very comfortable on the policy part. And that's why answer number 3 is the way it is once we get into the operations of how colleague works and the rules and the workflows, that's really up to more about what Sonia's work does and the BSAs, and they really have the expertise there as far as how colleague operates. And I want to be very careful and not go down that path at all. So I feel like I rambled there a little bit, and I don't know for sure how clear those answers were. So for policy questions, I feel like I can answer those questions. However, if you have a specific operations of how colleague works, then I would definitely refer you to our BSAs. So I'll pause there to see if there's any follow-up questions. Feel free to either unmute or to put it in the chat.
JW, this is Joyce Krieger. I'm the one that submitted it.
Oh, hey Joyce. I couldn't remember if it was you or not. I thought it might be.
No problem. The main reason I was doing it is because we're sending things up to the cashier's office, and the student has already dropped the class, but they paid during the semester, and bill's not working. So I wanted to make sure that was correct. It should be rebilling students who, let's say for spring, they dropped the class early in the semester, paid for at least a portion of the class, if not all, and then their residency changed. We're supposed to apply it to those dropped classes as well. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. That was the first thing. And then the second thing about the semesters is we have a winter semester or session. It kind of starts before fall ends, but it ends after fall. So I wasn't sure if that was going to be considered part of fall.
I understand. That's a very good question. The way it's set up is based upon the date of the change with the residency, and I cannot recall whether or not if somebody, for example, had a residency, the change date was in, let's say December 23rd, does that go back to the fall semester or does that move forward to the spring? And if Sonia's on the line, I think she would be able to answer that question, but I cannot recall how colleague is set up to handle that.
Okay, because our term ends the fall term ends, but the winter, which is a session in fall, continues after the fall end date.
Right,
And cashiering's having a problem with that. So I
understood.
wasn't sure.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. And so because of that uniqueness of that winter session you're talking about, that could definitely be a conversation with the BSAs. And Holly might need to get involved as well since it's on the finance side.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions, either in the chat or in the open your mic? Thank you, Joyce, for bringing that up, especially with the, I think a lot of colleges are moving towards some of these more unique terms like the winter sessions and multiple summer sessions and so forth. So I think those are very good questions and we appreciate you bringing that up. Okay, well then we'll go ahead and keep moving things forward. I saw Tracy in the list, so I think Tracy's here from RDS. Tracy, what updates do you have for us? Tracy, if you're talking, you haven't unmuted, we can't hear you. I'm going to check the roster here very quickly, everybody. Thank you for your patience. It looks like you've logged in, Tracy.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, we sure can. Thank you. The mic is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I was trying to do it through my phone and for some reason it wasn't working, so I had to switch to computer.
Okay.
The only update I really have is that we are going to run the clearinghouse process next month. And once we do, I'll update everybody on how many are extended and things like that. So we're going to do that in mid-May for continuous enrollment. The only other thing I have is the quarterly statistics. I've provided two, Q2 and Q3. Just overall, they generally look about the same, so I'll just talk about Q3. Overall, about a 7% decrease in the number of students using RDS. And also, I did note that the phone call count statistics are missing from the bottom of Q3. They didn't get included in my PDF creation, so I'll redo that one and send it to you. But the number of calls in Q2 were down 32%, and the number of calls in Q3 are down 40%. So we're still happy about that. Students being able to get through RDS with less technical issues and less questions and less having to call in. Overall, the rest of the statistics are pretty much in line with what we've been seeing. Is the trend for all of the quarters so far. Just a general decline, small decline in the number of students using RDS. Everything else is pretty normal. Unless there's any questions, that's all I've got.
All right, thank you, Tracy. Appreciate that. Do we have any questions for Tracy? We'll pause a second, see if there's anything in the chat or if you want to unmute your microphone. Okay, so not hearing or seeing anything, then thank you, Tracy. We appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and move on to our next section. I always like to do the reminder, the websites and the phone numbers that are available there, so that way it's easy access for everybody in their slides. And then we'll move on to Gene with his SEAA updates. Gene?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I just want to comment about SCA appeals. Once in a while, I'm asked about them. We had 2 in the second quarter, 3 in the third quarter. They were all sustained. We're actually getting very few. This is the final level of appeal that SCA is the agency named in statute to oversee the process. Will check RDS's determination on their appeal, the students asking for a review. Just so you know, it's very rare we get, I think, any of your students at a community college. These are almost always students who came here to attend a 4-year. They've been here a year or so, and to their mind, I've been living here a year. Some of them have actually been living in a dorm for a year, and they want to try to use that as a permanent residence. It's very rare. Once in a blue moon, we'll get somebody challenging the statutory requirement of 12 months, why it has to be 12 months, or once in a while we'll get someone who does not hold an eligible immigration status. But the most common scenario, and that's what happened this time again, is these are all students who came here for a 4-year, but they have no income, they don't have any independent financial aid, and they're acknowledging they're dependent on their parents in another state. So anyway, that's kind of typically what we're seeing. I got several questions about, and you may want to reach out, the short-term workforce development grants for the community college system. This was something that was kind of a late addition to the last legislative session. Okay, it was stuck in the appropriations bill, the budget, that certain designated courses, and JW, I'll let you kind of jump in later and correct me if anything, if I'm giving misinformation, may be eligible for a state grant. Unlike most state grants that are through the state grant system in SEAA, this one is administered directly by the community colleges. Part of the law that was passed requires the students who want to apply for one of these to meet the regular residency criteria and come to RDS. So this is new for the folks on the Con Ed side because continuing ed students, there isn't an in-state versus out-of-state tuition. They haven't needed to come to RDS. So I've gotten some calls from some Con Ed folks a little confused about it. And basically what my understanding is this is not every Con Ed student or even everyone in an eligible training, okay? It's if they're saying that they're a North Carolina resident and wanting to apply for the grant. So I kind of walked them through about RDS. What needs to happen at your end is, for the folks in the curriculum side have been used to dealing with RDS, is to come up and, partner and talk about workflows, about who's going to have access to the colleague information, or how will they know that the student's been approved, or, do I need to follow up that they haven't had a determination? Those are conversations that would probably have to happen at a college campus level. But it's not for every student. It's just select things. There was a 2-year period of approval of these grants. So you might get questions from your folks in the Con Ed side. JW, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
Yes, I think the only thing that I would add is that workflows and procedures were published by my counterpart up here at the system office, Mr. Nate Humphrey. And he worked very closely with the appropriate BSAs to develop that workflow, both the workflow piece and also the colleague piece as well. So please, your directors of workforce continuing education should have a copy of that workflow and our guidance about that. And I hesitate to give any specific guidance because that's really in Nate's lane as opposed to my lane. But Gina's exactly right. It's not a pre-registration requirement of any sort. It's not a requirement to enroll and pay fees. It's purely an eligibility requirement for the workforce grant.
Thanks. In that sense, it's kind of, I guess, parallel to what we do with the colleges, the independent and private colleges, universities. There's no in-state, out-of-state tuition, but if an individual student wants to apply for a state grant, at that point, they have to come to RDS. So anyway, just, that's good to know. Thanks, JW, that they did get guidance. I guess somehow it didn't make it to certain staff members that contacted me. So RDS, as you know, has a number of tracking flags. in the system. We're going to talk about the public high school one in a minute, that if a student tells us, for example, okay, I'm a veteran, I just moved here, I don't meet the residency criteria, but I have a benefit I can use, or that they are claiming eligibility for one of the campus-based exceptions, that's an informational flag that's passed on. We've had some, it's been difficult to clarify sometimes about tracking certain immigration students. So non-citizens, the only ones you have to track are those that we tell you need to track with a tracking date. But it was a little unclear because we also had a code of non-resident alien that was used for another purpose, kind of a dual thing for the community college exception that you have about someone who was lawfully admitted, but they may not have a current status. So what we've done is created a new code to make it very clear. It's NIMMT for non-immigrant tracking. And so we will still go ahead and put in there a tracking date to flag this. This only applies to students who have a visa or temporary protected status with a definite expiration date. The others do not need tracking, like a permanent resident. It is just that, it is permanent. Their card may have an expiration date, their status never expires. They do that to combat.
Company itself is not in North Carolina.
Okay, they do that to combat.
Are you housed here at all?
Okay, we've got someone on here. Can we mute? Thank you, JW. So it's just the ones that we indicate you have to do, but this should make it easier to run a query that NIMMT, those are the only ones you need to track. Likewise, the informational flags for public high school graduates we were asked about because remember last legislative session, there's a new provision for US citizens under certain circumstances that are public high school graduates. There are two separate codes in colleague, but RDS did not create a separate one. If the student reports that they are a public high school graduate and are not meeting the criteria with RDS, and if they report that, that gets flagged for you to review. It doesn't distinguish between the citizen and non-citizen. You could see that in the rest of the information from RDS, but it's not a separate code. We use one code, but then there are two codes in colleague because the criteria are different. You know, the biggest thing is if they're a citizen, it's only good for 1 year after their high school graduation. So, but it's one code it's a flag from RDS to bring that to your attention. And then you would have to review the other criteria since it's a campus-based exception. Last time we had a call, some questions came up and I gave you some guidance and then JW indicated we would bring it back to the HCAC Advisory Committee for discussion, which we did, about the role of the campus and collecting documentation and so forth, and about students that might have changes. So basically, we've affirmed the guidance I gave you, and I'm going to put that out in a little clearer fashion, but there are statements about it in the current campus responsibility guide for residency. But basically, RDS, whenever you're talking about a residency determination, that has to go to RDS. You don't have the ability in college to change residency. You do for a tuition exception. They'd still be non-resident, but get in-state tuition. And that has a lot of implications, including for grants. But legally, that part of it, the residency, has to go to RDS. So if a student is claiming they've had a change and they are residents, you need to direct them back to RDS because that's not something you're able to handle or even code into colleague. The question came up about collecting documentation. Okay. RDS is responsible for those residency determinations and validating it. You're not required unless your campus chooses to go above and beyond or has another reason, like for example, if a grant requires something, okay? It is not required to collect the documentation. RDS itself is trying to minimize, and we've gotten down to, I think last October with the college app season, only 5% of students were asked for a document, and it's only in something we can't validate electronically. we don't want to handle the documents. So when the question came up earlier about the military ID, we don't ask for that. We have other ways to validate that, including a military order. And, you know, it's just a lot of risk with personal information is my opinion. So, but the policy is you collect documents only for a campus-based exception. So if RDS says they're not eligible, they don't meet the legal criteria, but your campus is giving them an exception because they meet the criteria for the exception, you would want to document that. If financial aid has a requirement for some reason, you have to have a documented file, that's a different issue. But for residency purposes, if it's something RDS determines, you only have to do it if you're extending like the tracking of the visa or send them back to RDS. Some schools choose to do that. But RDS is responsible for maintaining evidence that that student met the criteria. It would just be for students you're extending or for students that you're giving an exception to. As I say, most of ours is done electronically at this point. It's only in rare cases where we have to ask for an actual document. The question also came up about some colleges wondering if they have to go and kind of regularly try to find out if the student is still living in North Carolina. And that's not an expectation. I think it's different if the student comes to you to change their permanent address saying, we all just moved to Virginia, okay? You're aware of it now, and I think there's a responsibility, but you can also put them on a grace period for a year. So there are possibilities there, but you know, it's not envisioned that a campus would have to enter into investigations and like on a regular basis have students keep bringing documentation in. If you have reason to be concerned and want to check, you do have the prerogative of sending a student back to RDS for a more recent determination on a reconsideration. And finally, I just want to mention something about the official documents. We issued a RDS guidebook in January 2022. Unfortunately, there's been a delay in the campus residency guide. I've got a draft in under review, and part of that was at the UNC side, they had a change in one of their exceptions for full scholarship, and that generated a lot of questions from campuses that needed review. But that should be out sometime within the next month, and we'll send that to you with updates in there. But in the meantime, if you have questions, let me know. And we talked with Monty a while back about probably sometime before fall gets underway, we'll look at another training if there's need for that. So that's what I have, JW. So want to see if there's questions or.
Excellent. Thank you, Gene. I definitely appreciate that. And thank you for mentioning the training, because I think it's good for us to have that refresher training on a regular basis, plus the updates, because there are changes and it is a fluid situation on some of these things. So any questions for Gene, either in the chat or unmute your microphone? All right, Gene, it looks like you're off the hook. Thank you for those updates. We appreciate that very much. So I'll go ahead and keep things rolling. We're almost completed here, friends, so not much more to do. So if we move on to our next slide here, I just have one thing really that I wanted to remind you of, and I think Gene has already mentioned it, and that's the new student type or exception for the U.S. citizen that's a North Carolina public high school graduate. Since that is new, I wanted to make sure that you had the reminder of what the student type is for this specific one, also where what page number it is on the manual, and then the link to the legislation since this is new. Remember that this is in response to the desire to empower the colleges so that they can try to have an opportunity to work with a student whom your experience tells you that they are probably a resident, but you need to buy some time because they're not what you might want to call a cookie cutter type of situation. And so there may be some issues going on in the surroundings around that student. And so this basically gives you some time to work with that student, basically a year after high school graduation, to help them get the documentation maybe that they're unable to find, to meet that 12-month requirement, whatever the issue might be. And then they can do a reconsideration and then come back hopefully as a resident. I do also want to remind you that these students with this student type are not eligible for the state grants. This only changes their billing for that 1 year for residency. So I encourage you, for those students who fall into this situation, remember that you have this available as we're coming into summer and fall registration periods, that this may be very helpful to some of your students that you're working with. So I'll pause there to see if there's any questions. We do have a question, not regarding this slide, Gene, but we do have a question regarding asylum.
Yeah, I see it in there. Yeah.
Okay.
A student seeking asylum. Okay, so in terms of at face value for RDS purposes, a person who doesn't have another immigration status currently, who's applied for asylum, is not eligible. They have to have a current status. And basically what happens is when someone comes to this country and claims asylum, if they register and obtain the documentation, they are able to stay at the discretion of U.S. immigration to remain present, but they have no status. So the only exception I can think of in this case that could apply is if that person, and this probably would not be the majority of the students, if that person was previously admitted on a visa, let's say a visitor visa, and they were lawfully admitted, their visa's running out, they couldn't qualify for another visa, and they're asking for asylum. To ask for asylum, you have to physically be present in the US. And if someone wasn't lawfully admitted, there's not much we can do. But if they were, and they happen to have been lawfully admitted at some point, even if that visa has long since run out, and we could document that, you may be able to, if they graduated the public high school, give them that exception for the tuition purposes. Unfortunately, people in this category, in recent years, there have been shifting of monies and whatnot, the budget cuts where the number of people processing these applications for asylum has gone way down. So unfortunately, what used to be a year or two is now turning into 6-8 years plus in many cases, unfortunately. They could be waiting. There's not much we could do because U.S. immigration defines them as having no status in terms of they're here while it's being determined, but they have no status. So that would be the only possible option. I don't imagine that's the majority, but it could apply to some students if they were a public high school graduate and could show they previously were admitted lawfully.
Yeah, thank you, Gene.
Yeah.
And as a follow-up question to that, oftentimes I hear conversations resolving around the distinction between asylee and refugee. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and people are using, I mean, refugee is out there. It's at the one hand a very generic term of someone seeking refuge or to come to this country, but immigration uses those categories very specifically, very narrowly. So let's say, for example, someone, we talked a while back about people coming here from Afghanistan or now possibly Ukraine, okay, that they're refugees. In all likelihood, they're probably not classified that way by immigration. In a broad popular sense of the term, they are. The difference is, from immigration's perspective, to get refugee status, you have to make a case and apply for a status prior to arriving in the US. They're given refugee status, okay? The person can be from the same country, have the same situation, but if they don't apply in advance and they're physically here, they must physically be present. At that point, they have to ask for asylum. The refugee label wouldn't apply anymore. Does that help?
Yes, sir. And there is a distinct exception code or exception for refugees, but not for asylees as well.
Yes. So the difference, and that's why the exception code for community colleges, basically it's allowing you to help the student who just arrived as a refugee. Oftentimes they're being sponsored by someone, or organization or family, to not have to meet the 12-month duration requirement, to help them with that, help them, hit the ground running. Asylees don't have a status. That refugee does have a lawful immigration status that, by the way, doesn't have an expiration date. So, they're okay, but the asylee in this case didn't apply and get approval in advance. They don't have a lawful status. What I would say is, if any of you in the colleges have some of these weird things, give a call and we'll try to look through it to look for any possibility. It's kind of like the DACA. There's really only one scenario or two that I know of that you could possibly help them, but these get really complicated and you don't deal with them every day. They're even complicated for us who do deal with them every day. So, give a call and, I'll be happy to talk it through with you and see if there's anything we can do or provide clarity.
Thank you, Gene. We appreciate that. Any other questions? Feel free to put those in the chat or unmute your microphone and ask. All right, I believe that brings us to a close. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. We'll get the updated slides and the recording out to you as quickly as we can. We probably will not schedule a residency liaison this summer. However, I do believe Monty and Gene will be, and probably Jesse as well, will be working on an updated training maybe for this summer sometime. And so unless something spectacular and new comes out, our next meeting will be this coming fall. So you guys have a great day, and we appreciate all the work that you do to serve your students.